Welcome back. We are here at Cornell Museum celebrating Earth Month today, and we're joined by Karis Peterson from the Reef Institute. The Reef Institute is right here in Palm Beach County. They're located in West Palm, and they are one of the few facilities that have a coral nursery and a library that is working in the state project to keep a genome for all the corals. Corals have been impacted tremendously due to climate change. There's a coral bleaching event right now that's occurring off the Great Barrier Reef, the largest bleaching event that has ever occurred. And we've also got coral bleaching certainly last summer here in the Keys. So it's a very important issue, and we really appreciate Karis being here to talk to us about what the Reef Institute does and benefits of coral.
Thank you. The first thing that I want to do is to dive into what coral is. So this first part of the video had sound on it, so I'm going to try to match the words on the screen pretty quickly here, but we'll see if I can keep up. So coral are these adorable little animals, and first off, they're animals. They're not plants or rocks. They do make beautiful skeletons. And each circle is called a coral polyp. And each one of these animals has its own mouth and tentacles to grab food. It is very closely related to jellyfish. And lots of corals together make a coral colony. They are very complex animals, and they are very unique. So all of these coral polyps in this one colony have the same DNA, and this coral polyp can share energy with the coral polyp over on the other side of the colony. This is a sneak peek into our facility. We will go through it a little bit slower here in a couple of minutes, but we take care of each coral polyp and colony, and our goal is to save the reef one coral at a time. The Reef Institute is the only coral conservation nonprofit here in Palm Beach County, and we do coral conservation through education, research, and restoration. I realized I forgot to give the full introduction of myself. I'm Karis Peterson, and I am the education coordinator at the Reef Institute, as well as one of our coral biologists. The Reef Institute was founded in 2016, and here's a video of our local reefs that I believe was taken sometime in the last 12 months. Although our corals take up less than 1% of the ocean floor, they provide crucial habitat and resources that 25% of all marine animals depend upon. Florida's coral reef is 360 miles long, going from Port St. Lucie all the way along our coastline, through the Florida Keys, and over to an island called the Dry Tortugas. Some used to call this the third largest barrier reef in the world. And as residents here in Florida, this next fact I think is one that's very important to us. Corals absorb up to 97% of the wave energy that passes over them. They protect our beaches and our homes from coastal erosion. Unfortunately, here in Florida, we only have somewhere between 2 and 5% of the coral that we used to have left. And I'm always asked what caused this. Simple answer, it's a one-word answer: humans. Here in Florida, there have been a lot of different diseases starting back in the 1970s. These are correlated with human interactions, and the most recent disease that we have is stony coral tissue loss disease. Stony coral tissue loss disease affects corals, and it will kill a coral colony in a matter of weeks to a matter of months. This disease started in 2014 around the Port of Miami during the time of the expansion. After a decade, we know very little about stony coral tissue loss disease. We don't know that if it's a bacteria or a virus, but we do know that it's able to be treated with amoxicillin. About a third of those treated survive, a third die, and a third recover, and will end up with the disease again. It's amoxicillin mixed with dental paste that they use to put dentures in that they apply to the corals in the ocean. And it affects about half of the species of coral here in Florida. Another huge threat to our corals here in Florida is coral bleaching. And coral bleaching, you can see here, this coral doesn't have quite as much color as it should. Coral bleaching. Corals have a symbiotic relationship with an algae called zooxanthellae, and this zooxanthellae gives the corals up to 90% of the food, the energy that the corals need, as well as their beautiful colors. If the water gets too hot, or too cold, or the water chemistry is weird in any other way, the algae will stress the coral out, and the coral will get rid of that algae because it's hurting it. And at this point, the coral is still alive, but it's missing 90% of its food source. It would be like if you had a fever and you were only eating bone broth. You could survive for a couple of days, it wouldn't be fun, but then you would be able to get your strength back and it'd be okay for most people. Same thing for coral bleaching. It's a natural thing that historically lasted a couple of days, every couple of decades, or longer in between those periods, but now we are seeing coral bleaching happening on a much longer time scale, lasting for months at a time and year after year, or several times a decade. So this coral is paling, meaning it's gotten rid of some of its zooxanthellae. And here you can see local reef. This is the other side of what our local reef looks like. You can see that it is dead. This used to be covered with large stony corals, and there aren't the fish living on this reef anymore. All of the fish that are left on this reef, for the most part, are around the one remaining coral that is left. This is what we mean by we've got between 2 and 5% of our coral reef left. There's still corals on the reef, but just covering less than 5% of that reef. At the Reef Institute, we take a rescue to reef approach. This includes rescue, conservation, restoration, and innovation, and it starts and ends with our education. We are a part of the Florida Coral Rescue and Propagation Project. This includes 26 organizations that gene bank coral or biobanks them. This project specifically targets species that are susceptible to stony coral tissue loss disease. And we are the only organization that does land-based holding as part of the Florida Coral Rescue and Propagation Project that's not associated with an aquarium, zoo, or university. And here you can see our coral lab. This is where we hold our corals. We don't go out in the ocean and collect the corals ourselves. The state of Florida helps collect the corals. We bring them into the lab. We make sure that they are nice and clean before giving them their home. And not only do we hold corals for the stony coral tissue loss disease, we also hold corals as a part to protect them from coral bleaching. These corals are parts from corals being used in coral restoration down in the Florida Keys. Corals are super awesome. You can break a coral in half and both halves are going to keep growing if they're in optimal conditions. This means that our reef is self-repairing when it's healthy. But it allows us to take a fragment of each of these corals being used in the Florida Keys and hold them in our facility, keeping them safe from, in case the worst happened in the ocean, we have the ability to start over. So this past summer, when the ocean temperatures got so hot, the restoration practitioners in the Keys wanted to get these corals out of the water. They needed a land-based backup in case the worst were to happen. So we are bolstering this gene bank as we speak, as we are expecting another record hot year this summer. And our conservation efforts are based and focused on coral spawning. Corals are animals. They have babies. And here you can see a coral releasing its gamete bundles of eggs and sperm that it was holding inside of its mouth, releasing them. They float to the surface of the ocean. And on the surface of the ocean, they break apart, and the egg and sperm from the different corals can find each other. This happens about once a year, and a couple days after the first full moon, the full moon in August. It all happens all at once. They need to have been healthy beforehand, not under a lot of stress, and allow these corals to grow and thrive. Here you can see one of the adult corals in our facility that has had babies. This is a golf ball coral. He's about the size of a golf ball, but that's the adult, and this is his baby. And a lot of our corals also come from our partners. We partner with SeaWorld and the Florida Aquarium that have been doing this project. And there are larval corals inside of the water bottle. There are larval corals inside of the water bottle, and we use a lot of very, very fancy scientific equipment at the Reef Institute to make sure that our babies are transported properly. The water bottles and everything. Corals can only move where they're at in the ocean from the time that they're about 3 days old to the time that they're about 7 days old. So here in a second, you're going to see the baby corals swimming. They are actually swimming. They're not being pushed around in the current. So this is the system that we hold them in, and here are the babies. So these are the larval corals moving around. And here you can see them swimming down to the bottom to find a perfect spot on one of these tiles to grow. It's the only time in their life that they can choose where to live. And this is a baby coral a couple of days after it has settled. You can see it's starting to build its skeleton and is getting ready to grow into a gorgeous coral colony. So the corals, they land, and then we will move them onto their own tile after about 6 months. And here, these corals are about 1 year old. This guy's a 1 year old. These guys are 1 year old coral. And these guys are about 2 years old. And these corals have actually been taken out into the ocean since this video was taken. Our restoration is focused on coral outplanting. So we take the baby corals out of the fish tanks that we hold them in, put them in coolers, transport them over to the boat, put them on the boat, take our boat out into the ocean where we use our fancy scientific laundry baskets to take our corals down to the bottom of the ocean, and then we glue them onto the bottom. That's me taking our first set of baby corals out into the ocean. And the process of actually gluing these corals to the reef. We take the corals and we use a 2-part marine epoxy, and we will scrub the reef nice and clean, find a good spot for them, and glue the corals to the reef with this epoxy. We use the tape measures so that we know exactly where they're at. We can lay that tape measure out once a month and figure out, we kind of name each one based off of where it's at on the tape measure, and see how is this coral doing compared to how it was doing last month. We find that the corals, the first week that we put them out, a couple of them will end up with a little bit of predation from triggerfish. And I feel like it's the triggerfish going, what is this new thing in my environment? And triggerfish don't have hands, so it can't touch it and look at it. The only option is to bite it. But after that first week, we didn't see any other predation on our corals. And the corals that are out there, the corals that have been out there for a year have about an 89% survival rate. And the part of that decline is due to human error. And the other corals that we recently put out more corals, I think in February. And those guys are doing wonderfully. They've got about a 95% survival rate at this point. So here in West Palm, our coral outplanting looks a little bit differently than it does in the Florida Keys. In the Florida Keys, I've outplanted corals where my feet were sticking up out of the water. Our dive site is 50 feet deep, and there is a ripping current. We have to hold on to the bottom so that we don't get blown away. So here you can see a coral that's been in the water for about 6 months. And this next guy you can see has been in the water for a year. And we can actually see him overgrowing the plug and the epoxy that he was on and growing onto the reef, which means that he is no longer dependent on the glue that we put down. He is going to be there for himself forever. And coral restoration in general is a relatively young field. There is so much room for innovation. This is Peanut Island. Peanut Island is a very, very special place. There are about 23 different species of stony corals. That's about half of what we have here in Florida. And they hang out in this lagoon area on these rock piles that you can see. And we monitor the corals at Peanut Island. They're super shallow. We monitor them for coral bleaching every year, and we've found that for the past 4 years, they bleach in the summer. This guy here, he loses that zooxanthellae. But the zooxanthellae can be more resilient to temperature, and it'll bring back in ones that are more resilient. And we see them change colors throughout the year as they are swapping out that algae. And if you're not super familiar with corals, I always like to point out that these brown circles, softball size guys, those are the corals on top of the rocks. One of our recent studies at Peanut Island is looking at the juvenile corals that are recruiting there. They are out there counting them and seeing how they are doing, and also looking at the currents and seeing how the way that the currents move, how is that correlated with where those corals landed. So they're still processing that information actively. Other ways that we innovate is working in the Caribbean. So here we are in the Bahamas, giving them the educational materials that they need to teach their locals about coral conservation and coral restoration. Our goal when we go to the Caribbean is to give the locals what they need to do coral restoration on their own. Everybody's coral through the Caribbean isn't at 100%. Everybody's in decline, and we don't need to be the heroes. They've got heroes on their islands themselves. We just need to support them. And this is a video of Turks and Caicos, where we've helped them establish a gene bank for holding corals. And we are actively, this weekend, my other team members are in Turks and Caicos working to establish a research system on another island that will, in the future, also be moving towards gene banking as well. The goal with the Caribbean is to use as many local resources as possible. Do they have somebody that makes fiberglass boats? Let's have them make the fiberglass vats. If something happens, then they have the resources to fix it. When we are working with our Caribbean partners, it's not let's ship all the PVC pipe over, it's go into your local hardware store and tell me what you have, and let's build it from there. Something else that we are doing with the Caribbean is our shipping containers. This is our pilot shipping container, and it's one that we've got here in West Palm at the Reef Institute. And these can be outfitted with solar panels on the top. They're hurricane proof and able to control the lights to be able to control those environments that the corals have so that we can have them spawn and make more coral babies. And these can be made and outfitted with the things that they have in their local communities. Another thing that we are doing with our innovation is our artificial reef structure called the wave tiles. These are modular and they can be stacked in various different ways. They are made up of 70% recycled materials. And they provide habitat for fish and invertebrates, replacing some of that habitat that has been lost. So this one right here is in Sugar Sands, so just north of the Blue Heron Bridge, and corals have been outplanted on it that were taken from a nearby artificial structure that was being revamped. I can't remember exactly what it was, but think like a seawall, like redoing a seawall. The last thing I want to talk to you all about is our education. We take a awareness to stewardship approach. We want to get as many people as possible knowing as much as possible about coral, caring for coral, and starting to take care of it on their own. We work with local schools, going into one of the local 5th grade elementary schools every week, providing them marine science throughout the year, as well as working with high school students and college students and seeing if marine biology and coral restoration is really what they want to do. And at the Reef Institute, we are growing. We are going to be moving into this awesome facility that is 21,000 square feet. And the facility that we currently have has about 3,800 gallons of salt water, and we're going to be able to have over 20,000 gallons of salt water here, as well as office space and the ability to have people there. I'm gonna have a classroom. We're moving up just around the corner from where we are at currently.